Hello, my name is Frederik Steinmetz and welcome to this introduction of Jacques Lucas's awesome animation nodes. I'm just going to be covering the very basics. We're not actually going to do a project in this video, but be sure there are going to be follow-ups where we'll actually have a look at what they're capable of. But right now I'd like to focus on the initial setup. If you go to blenderartist.org, you'll see this page, and if you type in animation nodes in the search field, one of the first ones, actually the first one, is going to be the animation nodes Addon by Jacques Lucas. And if you click on the GitHub link here, you'll get to the source code, and if you scroll down, you can download the zip file over here. Once you've done that, you can head over to Blender and either go to File, User Preferences, or press Ctrl-Alt-U, and under Add-ons you need to install from File. Okay, right now I've downloaded them to my downloads folder, and you can see I have a couple of versions already. If you double click on this, what will happen is you'll see the new add-on in front of you. If you don't, go to Node, and there it will be listed, and you can see I have the Node Wrangler enabled. I really like the Node Wrangler add-on, and it also ships with the trunk, but you can get some interferences with the animation nodes. So if you have that one enabled, I'd strongly suggest you'll disable it, at least until you get a feeling for what the nodes are going to do, so you can kind of spot if a mistake or an error message or something that just simply doesn't work can come by the incompatibility with another add-on. So right now I'm going to enable the check, which enables the nodes, and right now the version is 0.0.2. Sometimes in newer versions or older versions, which I don't recommend at all, go ahead and download the latest one. The UI will change a tiny bit, and maybe sometimes nodes get renamed. So if you try to follow this tutorial and don't find something at the exact spot where I explain it to be, just be a bit patient and check for similar spots or similar names. Anyways, if I close this, I can press Ctrl and left button, which does the same thing as choosing compositing from here, because we're going one step back from default to compositing. Okay, here we have a node editor. Obviously every node editor will do, but if we have the animation node add-on enabled, then we have access to this little symbol here, and in order to do something we need a new node tree. By default it's called node tree, and usually with the animation nodes you only need one. It's not per object, it's more like this one where you either use nodes or not. But unfortunately at the moment, if you switch over to any other node editor, it will disable the active node tree, so you have to re-choose it from the list here. Okay, if we press T, we get the tool shelf, just like we would in pretty much every Blender window. And if you can see, we have a lot of options here. If I press Ctrl up arrow, I can full screen this window, and you can see actually that those are created automatically by Blender, and they are the same as the add menu you get when you press Shift A. So if you don't like this add menu, or you know you're going to use a certain category very often, you can also enable them here. And if we have a look, if we choose text here, the lists are identical. And the buttons also do the same. Unfortunately, since Jacques has created quite a few nodes, 158 to be precise, at the moment this gets pretty crowded, but what I want to focus on is the settings, because once the nodes start to do something you don't expect, these settings are very important. Also, if your node tree becomes sluggish, so the Blender viewport starts lagging, then those checkboxes here are actually very important. So before I explain those, let's do something very simple. What I'm going to do is Shift A object and transforms output. Every node that has an object input comes with a little eyedropper here, and if you click it, the active object will be inserted in that field. Now, in order to make this node do anything at all, we need to check what it's supposed to do. I'm going to check the 3 locations, which brings up the location vector. Now, if I use a Shift-A animation time info node, I can put the frame to the location. Thing is, of course, the frame is a float, so it's a single number, while the location is a vector consisting out of 3 numbers, x, y, and z. So we need a vector combine vector node, and let's just take the x for the frame. So in theory, if I press Alt-A, the cube should wander along the x-axis. It does not, and that is probably the case because we connected something that isn't supposed to be connected. In this case, you can choose force update. This is a very important button because from time to time the updating process will be halted, and if the node tree doesn't behave in the way that you expect, then just click the force update, and that should usually fix the problem. So right now, the x location of the cube is exactly the frame. If I forward 1 frame, it's going to be at frame number 2. As long as your viewport doesn't lag at all, you don't need to worry about any of these checkboxes. But once you have a more complex node tree with particles, hair, metaballs, I tried, those got pretty sluggish fairly soon, you can disable the events on which the node tree, and by that the scene, gets updated. Frame changed means if you press left or right and then the frame changes, and if the checkbox is enabled, it will update the node tree and thereby the objects in the scene. Scene change will recalculate the nodes continuously, meaning even if you don't do anything, your scene gets recalculated in the background. Once again, if you have a lot of objects, that can make the Blender interface sluggish, so you can disable that. And for example, have the scene only updated if you change a property. The properties are not the properties over here. This only counts for the properties in the node tree. The isRendering you should probably leave checked on, because otherwise it might come to a crash. I'm exaggerating here for lack of a better word. It might come to a halt of the node tree while you're ending an animation, and that can be very frustrating. So right now there is an isRendering which will force an animation to update right before the rendering. Changing a frame, meaning pressing left or right, will redraw the viewport automatically. So if you use Alt-A for a playback, you might want to disable redraw viewport, because it might happen that the Alt-A command redraws the viewport anyways. Alt-A would be animation. And then the node tree might redraw the viewport as well. So in order to avoid that Blender redraws the viewport twice in an animation, you can uncheck redraw viewport, but in general you don't really need those check marks, only once your project becomes more complicated. Let's have a look at the last option, the skip frames, and they can be illustrated very well. If I change the skip frames to 5, it will update at frame 1, 6, 11, and so on. You can see that is very fast. What I'm going to do is a number math node, and I'll just divide that by 10. And now you can see every 5 frames the cube will jump, as opposed to a continuous motion if you don't skip frames. There are some nodes that are still waiting to find the right place in the list, and they can be found over here. You usually probably wouldn't use them that much, But for example, the vector from value, I happen to know that this is the last node that got inserted, so it's not inside the number yet because it's inside the math category, and the math category doesn't exist over here. So vector from value means you have one value and you output this value 3 times for x, y, and z. Control X doesn't work yet because in JAX animation nodes there are so many different types of inputs that it's really hard to make the Blender node tree guess which one would be the right connection if you choose to delete the node in the middle, because this one is a float and this one is a vector, and if I press Ctrl X in order to delete this, Blender would not know what to combine where. And actually you can see there's a really handy feature. If I connect the float output of the result onto here, and it automatically creates a combine vector which makes the float into a vector that is float 0, 0. But for example, if I were to use the vector from value, then it would create a float 3 times. So that would be 1, 1, 1, 2, 2, 2, 3, 3, 3, and so on. If I now press Alt A, you can see the cube is going up as well. So that's a very brief introduction for the animation nodes. Stay tuned on BlenderDiplom, there's more to come. My name is Frederik Steinmetz, and please do try this at home.